On the day my husband passed away, I said nothing about the $28 million inheritance or about the skyscraper in New York City under my name. That same night, my daughter-in-law screamed, "Pack your bags. The old leech doesn't stay here." I said, "Okay." Then I decided to do something that I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Alberta, and I'm 64 years old. On the day my husband Richard died, I thought the worst pain I could ever feel was losing the man I'd loved for 38 years. I was wrong. The worst pain came 12 hours later, when his own family showed me exactly what they thought I was worth. The funeral had been everything Richard would have wanted: dignified, respectful, filled with people whose lives he'd touched. I sat in the front pew wearing my navy dress, the one he always said brought out my eyes, holding my composure like a shield. Everyone kept whispering about what a devoted wife I'd been, how I'd cared for him through those final months of illness without a single complaint, if only they knew the half of it. Richard's son Marcus from his first marriage gave a beautiful eulogy. His daughter Sarah read a poem. Even his ex-wife Patricia managed to say something kind about the man who'd left her 20 years ago for me. I listened to it all, nodding when appropriate, accepting condolences with quiet grace. Everyone seemed to forget I wasn't just the second wife. I was the widow. The reception afterward was held at our house. Well, what everyone assumed was our house. I watched as family members I barely knew picked through the photo albums, as distant cousins calculated the value of our furniture with their eyes. Sarah's husband James kept asking pointed questions about Richard's business affairs, while Marcus's wife Jennifer made comments about how much the house must be worth. But it was Richard's daughter-in-law Cynthia who really caught my attention. She'd married our youngest, David, just 3 years ago, and from day one she'd made it clear she thought I was taking up space in this family. A gold digger who'd married Richard for his money, even though she had no idea what his money actually was or where it came from. All day, she'd been watching me with this calculating look in her eyes. When I'd excuse myself to check on the catering, she'd be whispering with Sarah in the corner. When I'd sit down for a moment to rest, the day had been exhausting, she'd give me these cold little smiles that made my skin crawl. The last guest left around 8:30. I was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with shaking hands, when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped right at the kitchen threshold. "Well, that's over with," Cynthia announced. I didn't turn around. I kept loading plates, focusing on the simple task to keep my grief from overwhelming me. "Thank you for helping organize everything," I said quietly. "Richard would have appreciated—" "Cut the act, Alberta." Her voice was sharp, cutting. I finally turned around. Cynthia stood there with her arms crossed, still wearing her black dress but having shed any pretense of mourning. Behind her, David shifted uncomfortably. Sarah and Marcus flanked them, creating what felt like a tribunal. "I'm sorry?" I managed. Cynthia stepped closer. "The grieving widow routine. You can drop it now. We need to talk about practical matters." My hands stilled on the dishwasher. What practical matters? This house. Richard's assets, the family business. She said each word like she was explaining something to a slow child. "David and I have discussed it with Marcus and Sarah. We think it's best if you start looking for your own place." The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. "My own place?" Sarah cleared her throat. "What Cynthia means is this house is quite large for one person, and frankly, the upkeep costs alone. Are you telling me to leave?" I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. Cynthia smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "I'm telling you to be realistic. You're 64 years old, Alberta. Richard took care of you while he was alive, but now you need to think about downsizing, finding something more appropriate to your situation." "My situation?" "Well, you never worked, did you? Richard provided everything. This house, your lifestyle, your security. But that was Richard's money. Richard's success." She gestured around the kitchen like she was already redecorating it in her mind. "The family needs to make some hard decisions about his estate." I felt something cold settle in my chest. This is my home. I've lived here for 15 years. And it's been wonderful, I'm sure. Marcus said, finally speaking up. But Dad would want us to be practical. There are 4 of us kids, plus grandchildren to think about. College funds, retirement planning. Richard left a will, I said. Yes, and we'll honor whatever small provision he made for you, Cynthia said dismissively. But let's be honest about what this is. You were his second wife, not his business partner. You didn't build anything together. You were just there. The words hit me like physical blows. Just there. After 38 years of marriage, after caring for him through cancer, after building a life together, I was just there. I think you should pack your things tonight, Cynthia continued. David and I can stay here to help manage the transition. It'll be easier for everyone if we handle Richard's affairs directly. I looked at David, silently pleading with him to defend me, to remember that I'd been his stepmother since he was 12 years old, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Where am I supposed to go? I asked. Cynthia shrugged. There are some lovely senior communities around here. Assisted living facilities. I'm sure you'll find something suitable. Assisted living. Like I was some helpless old woman who couldn't take care of herself. I stood there in my own kitchen, surrounded by people I'd considered family, and felt the last pieces of my heart break. The grief from losing Richard was nothing compared to this. This was betrayal. This was being erased from my own life. But as I looked at their faces, Cynthia's cruel satisfaction, the others' uncomfortable but determined expressions, something else began to grow alongside the pain, something cold and quiet and patient. Okay, I said simply. Cynthia blinked. Okay, I'll pack tonight. I'll be gone in the morning. The silence that followed was deafening. I think they'd expected me to fight, to beg, to make a scene that would justify their treatment of me. Instead, I turned back to the dishwasher and continued loading plates. Well, Cynthia said, clearly thrown off balance. Good. That's very mature of you. I didn't respond. I just kept working, listening as their footsteps retreated from the kitchen, as they began dividing up my life in hushed, excited whispers from the living room. They had no idea what they'd just done. They thought they were getting rid of a burden, claiming what was rightfully theirs. They thought Richard's widow was just an old woman with nowhere to go and nothing to fight with. They were about to learn how wrong they were. As I closed the dishwasher and listened to it hum to life, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Tomorrow, my real life would begin, and theirs, well, theirs was about to get very, very complicated. I packed 2 suitcases that night, just 2. Everything else, the jewelry, the artwork, the designer clothes Cynthia was probably already mentally cataloging, I left behind. Let them think it was all they were getting. Let them believe the grieving widow was walking away with nothing but some old dresses and memories. The Hampton Inn on Route 1 became my temporary home. Not exactly the Ritz, but it had a business center, reliable Wi-Fi, and most importantly, it was anonymous. I checked in under my maiden name, Alberta Morrison, and paid cash for a week. The desk clerk barely looked at me. Just another senior citizen traveling alone, probably visiting grandchildren or attending a funeral. Perfect. Invisible was exactly what I needed to be right now. The first call I made was to Harold Steinberg. Harold had been Richard's attorney for 25 years, but more than that, he'd been mine for the past 15. Not that anyone in Richard's family knew that, of course. They assumed I was just the wife, that Harold handled only Richard's affairs. Alberta, Harold's voice was warm when he answered. I'm so sorry for your loss. Richard was a good man. Thank you, Harold. I need to see you. Tomorrow, if possible. Of course. 10 o'clock? Actually, could we meet somewhere other than your office? Somewhere private? There was a pause. Harold had known me long enough to read between the lines. The family's giving you trouble? Something like that. I'll come to you. Text me the address. Harold arrived the next morning carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd dealt with family greed more times than he cared to count. I'd ordered coffee and pastries from room service, a small luxury that would have raised eyebrows if anyone had been watching. But that's the beauty of being invisible. No one watches you when they think you don't matter. How bad is it? Harold asked, settling into the room's single armchair. I told him about the previous night, about Cynthia's demands, about being told to find appropriate housing, about how they'd dismissed me as someone who'd never contributed anything to Richard's success. Harold's jaw tightened as I spoke. Do they have any idea about your actual situation? None whatsoever. Richard and I decided years ago that it was better that way. Let them think he was the business mogul and I was just the pretty second wife. And you're sure you want to proceed as we discussed? I looked out the hotel window at the parking lot, at the ordinary cars filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yesterday, they would have seen me as one of them, just another older woman, probably widowed, probably struggling. They had no idea that the woman in room 237 owned more property than most of them could imagine. I'm sure. How long will it take? Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. The preliminary transfers can be completed within 48 hours. The complete restructuring will take about 2 weeks, and there's no way they can contest it? Alberta, everything has been legally yours for over a decade. Richard transferred ownership years before his illness, precisely to avoid situations like this. They can contest it all they want. They'll lose. I nodded, feeling that cold satisfaction settle deeper into my bones. What about the house? That's where it gets interesting. Harold allowed himself a small smile. Technically, you could evict them today, but I assume you have something more educational in mind? I want them to show me exactly who they are first. Let them get comfortable in my house, making their plans, dividing up what they think is theirs. Give them enough rope to hang themselves. And then I'll remind them that assumptions can be dangerous things. Harold spent the next hour walking me through documents, explaining procedures, confirming details that had been set in motion years ago. Most widows would be lost in the legal terminology, overwhelmed by the complexity of estate planning and asset management. But I wasn't most widows. After Harold left, I drove to the house, my house. I parked across the street and watched through tinted windows as moving trucks arrived. Cynthia directed workers like she was orchestrating a military campaign, pointing at Richard's study, gesturing toward the bedrooms. She'd brought her own furniture, I realized. She wasn't just staying temporarily to handle affairs. She was moving in permanently. My phone buzzed. A text from David. Hope you found a nice place, Alberta. Cynthia's getting Dad's office organized. Found some business files we need to go through. I almost laughed out loud. Business files in Richard's study. If they only knew that Richard's real business files weren't in that house at all. They were in a safety deposit box downtown, along with property deeds, stock certificates, and documentation that would turn their world upside down. But let them look through his desk drawers and filing cabinets. Let them find his appointment books and client lists from the small consulting firm everyone thought was our only source of income. Let them calculate modest assets and plan modest inheritances. The truth would be so much more devastating when it came. I drove to downtown and spent the afternoon at First National, where I'd maintained accounts they knew nothing about. Margaret Chen, my personal banker, greeted me with professional sympathy. Mrs. Morrison, I was so sorry to hear about your husband's passing. How are you holding up? As well as can be expected. I need to make some account adjustments. Margaret nodded, probably assuming I needed to add Richard's name to survivor benefits or update beneficiary information. Instead, I handed her Harold's documentation. Her eyes widened as she read. Mrs. Morrison, these amounts. I had no idea you were working with such substantial assets. Privacy was important to my husband and me, but circumstances have changed. I can see that. When would you like these transfers to take effect? Immediately. As Margaret processed the paperwork, I thought about Cynthia back at the house, probably going through my closet, deciding which of my clothes were worth keeping. I thought about Marcus and Sarah, likely meeting with financial advisors to discuss their father's estate. I thought about David, weak David, who'd let his wife bully the woman who'd raised him. They thought they'd gotten rid of me. They thought the inconvenient widow was out of the way, leaving them free to claim their inheritance. They had no idea that they'd just picked a fight with someone who'd spent 38 years learning how to play the long game. My phone rang as I was signing the last of the transfer documents. Cynthia's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with growing amusement. Alberta, we found some confusing paperwork in Richard's office. Legal documents that don't make sense. Could you call me back? There might be some things you need to explain. Confusing paperwork? I could only imagine what they'd found. Probably the outdated copies Richard kept for show, documents that referenced assets that no longer existed under his name. They were getting nervous, realizing that their father's financial picture wasn't as clear-cut as they'd assumed. I deleted the message without responding. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them spend sleepless nights trying to figure out why nothing added up the way they'd expected. Tomorrow, I would start phase 2 of my plan. Tonight, I would have dinner in my anonymous hotel room and watch the news like any other senior citizen spending the evening alone. But I wasn't alone. Not really. I had Harold. I had Margaret. I had a network of professionals who'd been quietly managing my affairs for years. And most importantly, I had time. Cynthia and her allies thought they'd won a quick victory. They had no idea they'd just declared war on someone who'd been preparing for this battle longer than they'd been part of this family. The grieving widow was done grieving. Now it was time for the real Alberta Morrison to emerge from the shadows. And when she did, the family that had dismissed her so easily would learn that some assumptions cost more than others. 3 days had passed since I'd moved into the Hampton Inn, and I could tell the family was getting restless. My phone had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from Cynthia, each one more demanding than the last. She wanted me to come back and explain some discrepancies they'd found in Richard's paperwork. She needed me to sign documents. She had questions only I could answer. I ignored them all. Instead, I spent my mornings in the hotel's business center, making calls that would have shocked them senseless. Tuesday, I spoke with the property management company that handled my 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan. Wednesday, I had a conference call with my investment advisor about moving some assets around. Thursday, I spent 2 hours on the phone with architects about renovation plans for the building I owned in Soho. The building. My little secret that even Richard hadn't fully understood the value of when I'd bought it 15 years ago with money from my first marriage. Back then, it had been a rundown warehouse in a neighborhood nobody wanted. Now it was worth $28 million. And the rent from the high-end lofts I'd created generated more income in a month than Richard's consulting firm had made in a year. But they didn't know any of that. To them, I was still just the second wife who'd never worked a day in her life. On Friday morning, Harold called with news that made me smile for the first time since Richard's funeral. "They've hired an attorney," he said without preamble. "Have they now?" "Jackson Morrison from Morrison and Associates. No relation to you, I assume, despite the name. Never heard of him. What does he want?" "He's asking questions about Richard's estate. Apparently, the family has some concerns about asset distribution and wants to ensure everything is being handled properly." I set down my coffee cup, feeling that familiar cold satisfaction spread through my chest. How proper of them to be concerned. There's more. They're requesting a formal reading of the will. They want all beneficiaries present, including you. When? Monday afternoon. 2 o'clock, at their attorney's office. Perfect. I'll be there. Alberta, are you sure you're ready for this? Once we walk into that room, there's no going back. They're going to learn exactly who you are. I looked out my hotel window at the ordinary world beyond, at people going about their ordinary lives with ordinary problems. Soon, very soon, I would no longer be invisible to the family that had dismissed me so easily. "Harold, I've been ready for 15 years. That weekend, I went shopping. Not at the discount stores they probably expected a newly poor widow to frequent, but at the boutiques I'd always preferred. I chose a navy blue suit, elegant but understated, along with my grandmother's pearl necklace and the Cartier watch Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman of substance who had simply chosen to be underestimated. Sunday evening, I moved out of the Hampton Inn and into the penthouse suite at the Fairmont Hotel downtown, just for one night, just to remind myself who I really was before walking into that meeting. I ordered room service, lobster and champagne, and reviewed the documents Harold had prepared. Everything was in order. Everything was legal. Everything was about to change. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, applied my makeup with precision, and arrived at Morrison & Associates 15 minutes early. The receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, looked me over with barely concealed dismissal. "You're here for the Holloway estate reading?" she asked, checking her computer screen. "I am." "And you are?" "Alberta Morrison, the widow." Something in my tone made her look up sharply, but before she could respond, voices erupted from down the hall. Loud, angry voices that I recognized immediately. "This is ridiculous," Cynthia was saying. "Why does she even need to be here? She's not a real beneficiary. The law requires all named parties to be present," came an unfamiliar male voice. Their attorney, presumably. "But she didn't contribute anything to the estate," Marcus added. "Dad supported her, not the other way around. Nevertheless, she has legal standing as the surviving spouse." I listened to them argue about me like I was an inconvenience, a legal technicality to be managed. The receptionist kept glancing at me nervously, probably wondering if I was going to break down or cause a scene. Instead, I sat quietly in the leather chair, hands folded, looking exactly like the kind of little old lady they expected me to be. At exactly 2:00, Harold arrived. He nodded to me with professional courtesy, giving no indication that we'd spent hours planning this moment. Behind him came a woman I didn't recognize, tall, sharp-suited, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Mrs. Morrison," Harold said formally, "I'd like you to meet Catherine Walsh. She'll be representing your interests today." Catherine extended her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I've heard a great deal about your situation." Before I could respond, Jackson Morrison himself appeared, a soft-looking man in his 50s who seemed overwhelmed by the circumstances he'd been hired to manage. "Well," he said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief, "I believe everyone is here now. Shall we proceed?" The conference room was larger than it needed to be, with a polished table that could have seated 20 people. The family had arranged themselves on one side like they were preparing for battle. Cynthia sat at the head, flanked by David and Sarah, with Marcus positioned slightly behind them like backup. They'd dressed for success, expensive suits, confident postures, the look of people who expected to inherit everything. I took the seat directly across from them, with Harold and Catherine on either side of me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Jackson Morrison cleared his throat and began reading Richard's will in a monotone voice that suggested he'd done this hundreds of times before. The standard language about being of sound mind, the formal declarations, the preliminary bequests to charity. Then came the part they'd been waiting for. "To my beloved children, Marcus, Sarah, and David, I leave the sum of $50,000 each, to be distributed equally among them." I watched their faces carefully. 50,000 each was generous for most families, but it was far less than they'd expected. Cynthia's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah frowned. Marcus leaned forward like he'd misheard. "And to my dear wife, Alberta Morrison Holloway, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, to be hers absolutely and without restriction." The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson Morrison continued reading, but I could see that no one was listening anymore. They were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to disbelief. "Excuse me," Cynthia interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Could you repeat that last part?" Jackson Morrison looked uncomfortable. "The bulk of Mr. Holloway's estate goes to his widow, as is customary in such circumstances." "But what exactly does that include?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "The house? His business? What are we talking about here?" It was Catherine Walsh who answered, consulting her own copy of the will with professional detachment. "According to these documents, Mrs. Morrison inherits all real property, all financial accounts, all business assets, and all personal property not specifically mentioned elsewhere in the will." "That's impossible," Marcus said flatly. "Dad would never leave us with just 50,000 each." Harold leaned forward slightly. "I'm afraid it's quite legal, Mr. Holloway. Your father was very specific about his intentions." "But she didn't earn any of it," Cynthia exploded, finally losing the composure she'd been struggling to maintain. "She never worked. She never contributed anything. She was just there, living off his success." The words hung in the air like poison. Just there. The same phrase she'd used the night she'd thrown me out of my own home. The same dismissal. The same contempt. The same fundamental misunderstanding of who I really was. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on me. For 38 years, I had let Richard be the face of our success. I had allowed people to assume he was the business mind while I played the supporting wife. I had been content to remain in the shadows, building my empire quietly while he took the credit publicly. But Richard was gone now, and the shadows had served their purpose. "You're absolutely right, Cynthia," I said quietly. "I never contributed anything to Richard's success." She blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. Richard's consulting firm, his modest investments, his reputation in the community, that was all him. I had nothing to do with any of it. I could see confusion rippling across their faces. This wasn't the response they'd expected. "But you see," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "Richard's estate isn't what you think it is, and I'm not who you think I am." Catherine Walsh was already reaching into her briefcase, pulling out documents that would change everything. Harold was checking his watch, timing the moment perfectly. "What do you mean?" David asked, speaking for the first time since the reading began. I looked at each of them in turn, these people who had dismissed me, who had thrown me out of my own home, who had treated me like a burden to be disposed of. "I mean," I said, allowing myself the smallest smile, "that you've been operating under some very expensive assumptions about who owns what in this family." The real game was about to begin. Catherine Walsh opened her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The documents she withdrew were organized in neat folders, each one labeled with the kind of detail that suggested this moment had been planned for a very long time. "Perhaps," Catherine said in her crisp professional voice, "we should clarify exactly what constitutes Richard Holloway's estate." Jackson Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "The question," Harold interjected, "is whether Richard actually owned the assets that his family believes they're inheriting." I watched Cynthia's face carefully. The confident smirk she'd worn since entering the room was beginning to crack around the edges. "Of course he owned them," she said, but there was a new uncertainty in her voice. "The house, the business, everything. Alberta never worked, never contributed financially." "That's where you're wrong," Catherine interrupted, sliding the first document across the polished table. "Mrs. Morrison has been the primary owner of virtually every significant asset in this family for over 15 years. The paper landed in front of Cynthia with a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. She stared at it like it might bite her. "This is the deed to the property at 47 Elm Street," Catherine continued. "The house you've been living in since Mrs. Morrison graciously vacated it. Notice the name on the title." Cynthia picked up the document with trembling fingers. Her face went white as she read. "Alberta Morrison," she whispered. "That's correct. The house was transferred to Mrs. Morrison's sole ownership in 2008, 5 years after their marriage. Mr. Holloway retained lifetime occupancy rights, but ownership transferred completely upon his death." Sarah grabbed the paper from Cynthia's hands, scanning it frantically. "This has to be a mistake. Dad bought that house before he even met her." "He did," Harold confirmed, "and then he refinanced it in 2007 using capital that Mrs. Morrison provided. When the new mortgage was issued, ownership transferred to her as the primary financial backer." "What capital?" Marcus demanded. "She never had any money." Catherine smiled, a cold, professional expression that reminded me why I'd hired her. "Mrs. Morrison has had considerable assets since before her marriage to your father. She simply chose not to advertise that fact." I had been quiet long enough. These people had spent the last week living in my house, planning their futures based on my assets, treating me like a discarded inconvenience. It was time for them to understand exactly who they'd been dismissing. "The money came from my first marriage," I said calmly. "When my first husband died in 1995, he left me quite well provided for. Real estate investments, stock portfolios, life insurance. I was 38 years old and financially independent when I met your father." The silence in the room was deafening. "But you never worked," David said weakly, like he was clinging to the last piece of his worldview. "I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed investments. I bought and sold properties. I made business decisions." I gestured toward Catherine, who was already preparing the next folder. "I just did it quietly." Catherine slid a new set of documents across the table. These are the ownership papers for Morrison Holdings LLC, established in 1996. Mrs. Morrison is the sole proprietor of a company that owns 17 properties across 3 states. Cynthia's hand flew to her throat. 17 properties, including 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan, 2 office buildings in Boston, and a recently renovated warehouse in Soho that was just appraised at $28 million. The number hit the room like a physical force. I watched as the implications sank in, as their understanding of reality shifted and cracked. 28 million? Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's just one property, Harold added helpfully. Would you like to see the complete portfolio? He didn't wait for an answer. Document after document appeared on the table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Bank statements showing accounts with balances that made Richard's modest savings look like pocket change. Investment records detailing stock holdings in companies they'd never heard of. Property deeds from Maine to Florida. The total value of Mrs. Morrison's holdings, Catherine announced, consulting her summary sheet, is approximately $47 million. Not including the assets she inherited from Richard's estate, which, as we've established, amount to roughly $300,000 in business assets and personal effects. $47 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cynthia was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just shock, but something approaching terror. You're lying, she said, but her voice had no conviction behind it. Which part would I be lying about? I asked pleasantly. The part where I've been financially independent since before I met Richard? Or the part where you've been living in my house for the past week? But why didn't Richard ever say anything? Marcus asked, looking genuinely confused. Because I asked him not to. I leaned back in my chair, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. Richard had his pride. He wanted to be seen as the provider, the successful businessman. I was happy to let him have that image publicly while I handled things privately. So, when we asked you to leave, David said slowly, you were actually... I was being evicted from my own home by people who had no legal right to be there. The truth of what they'd done was finally sinking in. I could see it in their faces, the growing horror as they realized they hadn't just been cruel to a helpless widow. They'd been cruel to someone who could destroy them financially without breaking a sweat. The business cards you found in Richard's office, Catherine continued, clearly enjoying their distress, were for a consulting firm that Mr. Holloway operated as essentially a hobby. It generated maybe $40,000 a year in revenue, hardly enough to support the lifestyle you all assumed he was funding. Then how did he pay for everything? Sarah asked. He didn't, I said simply. I did. The mortgage on the house, the property taxes, the utilities, the insurance, all of it came from my accounts. Richard contributed his consulting income, which covered groceries and incidentals. Cynthia was shaking now, visibly trembling as the full scope of her mistake became clear. You let us think. I let you reveal exactly who you were, I corrected. I didn't force you to throw me out of my own house. I didn't make you call me a sanguessuga. I didn't tell you to treat a grieving widow with contempt and cruelty. The word sanguessuga, bloodsucker in Portuguese, a term Cynthia had used thinking I wouldn't understand, made her flinch. I gave you every opportunity to show kindness, to include me in your family, to treat me with basic human dignity. Instead, you showed me your true character. Jackson Morrison was looking around the room like he'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. I think there may be some misunderstanding here about the nature of these assets. There's no misunderstanding, Harold said firmly. Everything is documented, legal, and has been properly maintained for years. Mrs. Morrison was under no obligation to disclose her financial situation to her stepchildren. But what does this mean for us? Marcus asked, his voice small and frightened. Catherine consulted her papers with theatrical precision. Well, legally speaking, you each inherit exactly what your father left you. $50,000. As for your current living situation, she looked directly at Cynthia. You're currently residing in Mrs. Morrison's property without her permission. That would technically make you trespassers. The word trespassers hit like a slap. Cynthia's face cycled through several colors before settling on a sickly gray. You can't be serious, she whispered. I'm completely serious, I said, standing up slowly. You wanted me out of the way so you could claim what you thought was rightfully yours. You succeeded in getting me out of the way. Unfortunately for you, nothing was rightfully yours to begin with. I gathered my purse and looked at each of them one final time. These people who had treated me like garbage, who had dismissed my grief and my worth, who had tried to erase me from my own life. I'll give you 72 hours to remove your belongings from my house, I said quietly. After that, I'll have you legally evicted. As I walked toward the door, Cynthia's voice followed me, high and desperate. Alberta, please. We can work something out. We're family. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the door handle. Family, I repeated softly. You know, Cynthia, you're absolutely right. We are family. And you've just taught me exactly what that word means to you. I walked out of that conference room knowing that my old life was over. The invisible widow was gone forever. In her place stood someone they should have been much more careful about crossing. The real reckoning was just beginning. The 72 hours I'd given them turned into the most satisfying 3 days of my life. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, I'm not cruel by nature, but because for the first time in decades, I was watching people face the real consequences of their choices. The first call came 6 hours after the meeting. Cynthia, of course, her voice a mixture of desperation and barely contained rage. Alberta, we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I was in my penthouse suite at the Fairmont, enjoying a glass of wine and watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold. Has it? I thought we talked quite thoroughly this afternoon. You know what I mean. The house, the money, all of it. There has to be some way to work this out reasonably. Reasonably. I let the word hang in the air. Like how you reasonably threw me out of my own home the night my husband died. Silence on the other end. Then, we were grieving too, Alberta. We weren't thinking clearly. You were thinking clearly enough to have me pack my bags and find somewhere else to live within hours of Richard's funeral. You were thinking clearly enough to start dividing up what you thought was your inheritance. But we're family. No, Cynthia. You made it very clear that I'm not family. You called me a sanguisuga, remember? A bloodsucker who never contributed anything. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She hadn't expected me to understand the Portuguese insult. I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said. The only thing you didn't mean was for me to be in a position to do anything about it. I ended the call and blocked her number. The next morning brought David to my hotel. The concierge called up to announce him, asking if I wanted to receive visitors. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. David had always been the weakest of Richard's children, the one most easily led by stronger personalities. I wanted to see how he'd handle this situation when his wife couldn't speak for him. He sat across from me in the hotel's elegant lobby, wringing his hands like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The man was 35 years old, but he looked like he might cry. Alberta, I'm so sorry about everything. Cynthia gets carried away sometimes, and I should have stopped her. Should have, could have, would have, I said calmly. But you didn't. I know, and I regret that. But you have to understand. We thought Dad had left us provided for. We thought the house, the business, everything would be ours to share. And when you thought that, your first instinct was to throw me out onto the street. David's face flushed. It wasn't like that. We just thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, more manageable. David. My voice was sharp enough to cut through his rambling. Stop lying. To me, and to yourself. You wanted me gone so you could have everything without having to consider my needs or feelings. He stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Cynthia said terrible things. Yes, but you stood there and let her. You could have defended me. You could have reminded her that I'd been your stepmother for over 20 years, that I'd raised you from the time you were 12 years old. Instead, you watched her humiliate a grieving woman and said nothing. I'm saying something now, he whispered. Now that you know I don't need your charity, now that you realize I'm not the helpless widow you can discard, your apology isn't about remorse, David. It's about fear. He looked up then, and I saw that I was right. His eyes were filled with terror. What are you going to do to us? The question hung between us like a blade. What was I going to do? I had the power to destroy them financially, to make their lives as difficult as they'd tried to make mine. I owned properties they could never afford, had connections they couldn't imagine. I could make them suffer in ways they couldn't even comprehend. But looking at David, weak, frightened David who'd never had an original thought in his adult life, I realized something. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted something much more valuable than revenge. I wanted them to learn. I'm going to do exactly what I said I would do. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your belongings from my house. After that, I'm changing the locks. And then? And then, you're going to figure out how to live your own lives, make your own decisions, and face your own consequences. No more depending on family money that was never really family money to begin with. David's shoulders sagged. Cynthia's going to lose her mind. Cynthia's going to learn that actions have consequences, just like you are. He left without another word, and I watched him walk away, knowing that this conversation had changed something fundamental between us. Not forgiveness. That would take time if it ever came at all. But understanding. The final 24 hours were the most interesting. I had Harold arrange for a locksmith to be ready, and I drove to the house at exactly 6 o'clock on Friday evening to see if they'd honored the deadline. The driveway was full of cars. Not just David and Cynthia's vehicles, but Marcus's truck, Sarah's sedan, even some cars I didn't recognize. As I sat in my rental car watching the house, I realized they were having some sort of family meeting. About me, presumably. About what to do with the problem I'd become. I walked to the front door and used my key. They hadn't thought to change the locks, probably because it had never occurred to them that I might still have one. The voices from the living room stopped abruptly when they heard the door open. "Hello?" I called out pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. It is my house, after all." I found them arranged around the living room like a war council. Cynthia sat in what had been Richard's favorite chair, still playing the role of matriarch. Marcus and Sarah flanked her, while David hung back near the window. There were two people I didn't recognize. A middle-aged couple who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Alberta," Cynthia said, standing up with forced dignity. "We were hoping you'd come by. We wanted to discuss a reasonable settlement to this whole misunderstanding." "Settlement?" I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the house, obviously. David and I have put a lot of work into this place, a lot of improvements. We think we deserve some compensation for— You think you deserve compensation for living in my house rent-free for a week?" The unknown couple exchanged glances. The woman cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should go, Cynthia. This seems like a private family matter." "No, please stay," I said warmly. "I'm Alberta Morrison, Richard's widow." "And you are?" "Tom and Linda Patterson," the man said reluctantly. We're Cynthia's parents." "Ah. So they'd brought in reinforcements." Cynthia's parents probably told some version of events that painted me as the villain in this story. "How lovely to meet you," I said. "I hope Cynthia has explained the situation accurately." Linda Patterson looked between her daughter and me with obvious confusion. She said there was some sort of dispute about Richard's will, about who gets what. "There's no dispute," I said calmly. "The will is very clear. Richard left modest bequests to his children, and everything else to me. The only complication is that most of what people assumed was Richard's property was actually mine all along." Tom Patterson frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Neither did they, until a few days ago. You see, I've been financially independent since before I married Richard. The house they've been living in belongs to me. The comfortable lifestyle they've been enjoying was funded by my assets, not Richard's. I watched the older couple process this information, watched their expressions change as they realized their daughter might not have been entirely truthful about the circumstances. "But Cynthia said you never worked," Linda said slowly. "I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed a rather substantial investment portfolio." I smiled pleasantly. "About $47 million worth, as it turns out." The silence that followed was profound. Tom Patterson's mouth actually fell open. "So, when your daughter threw me out of this house the night Richard died," I continued conversationally, She was essentially evicting me from my own property. When she called me a bloodsucker who never contributed anything, she was speaking to someone who had been supporting the entire family for years. Cynthia's face had gone white. Her parents were staring at her with expressions of horror and disbelief. "Cynthia Marie Patterson," her mother said in the tone of voice that probably hadn't been used since Cynthia was 12 years old. "Please tell me you didn't actually throw this woman out of her own house at her husband's funeral." It's complicated, Mom. It's not complicated at all, I said gently. Your daughter made assumptions about my financial situation and treated me accordingly. She's now learning that assumptions can be expensive. Tom Patterson stood up, his face red with embarrassment. "Mrs. Morrison, on behalf of our family, I want to apologize. If Cynthia did what you're saying, Dad, don't. If she treated you that way during your time of grief, then she was raised better than that and should know better." He looked at his daughter with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. "We're leaving, Linda. This isn't something we want to be part of." As Cynthia's parents gathered their things and headed for the door, I could see the final pillar of her support system crumbling. She'd counted on them to back her up, to see her as the victim in this situation. Instead, they'd seen her for what she really was. 20 minutes, I announced to the room as the front door closed behind the Pattersons. "Then I'm changing the locks whether you're finished or not." They scrambled then, grabbing bags and boxes they'd obviously packed in preparation for this confrontation. Sarah and Marcus avoided eye contact as they carried their belongings to their cars. David moved like a man in a trance, but Cynthia stood in the center of the living room, staring at me with something approaching hatred. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied, equally quiet. "It is." She left without another word, and I watched from the window as the cars pulled out of my driveway one by one. When the last taillight disappeared around the corner, I called Harold. "It's done," I told him. "They're gone. How do you feel?" I considered the question as I walked through my house, really looked at it for the first time since Richard's death. It felt different now, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the very walls. "I feel free," I said finally. And for the first time in a week, that was absolutely true. 6 months after that final confrontation, I was sitting in my garden watching the sunrise paint my roses pink and gold when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days, I was much more selective about who I allowed into my peaceful mornings. But the number looked familiar, and curiosity won out over caution. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Dr. Elizabeth Chen at Mercy General Hospital. I have a patient here asking for you." My blood ran cold. "Who?" "David Holloway. He's listed you as his emergency contact." Emergency contact. After everything that had happened, after the way his family had treated me, David had still listed me as the person to call in a crisis. Despite myself, I felt a familiar pang of maternal concern. "What happened?" "Car accident. He's stable, but he's asking for you specifically. Said to tell you it's important." 20 minutes later, I was walking through the sterile corridors of Mercy General, my heels clicking against the polished floor. I'd changed out of my gardening clothes into something more appropriate, a simple blue dress that Richard had always liked, paired with the pearl earrings he'd given me for our anniversary. I found David in a private room, his left leg in a cast and his arm in a sling, but otherwise looking remarkably well for someone who'd apparently wrapped his car around a tree. "Alberta." His voice was soft, relieved. "You came." "Of course I came. You're hurt." He tried to sit up straighter and winced. The nurse said they couldn't reach Cynthia. Her phone's been disconnected. I wasn't surprised. In the month since they'd been forced out of my house, I'd heard through the small-town gossip network that David and Cynthia's marriage had imploded spectacularly. Apparently, learning that your financial security was built on lies and assumptions had put considerable strain on their relationship. "Where is she now?" I asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed. "Gone. She left 3 months ago. Took what was left of our savings and moved back in with her parents." David stared at the ceiling, his voice hollow. "She said she married me for the lifestyle, not for me, when the lifestyle disappeared." "I'm sorry, David. Are you?" He turned to look at me, and I was startled by the clarity in his eyes. "Even after everything we did to you?" I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry? 6 months ago, I would have said that Cynthia leaving was exactly what David deserved. But looking at him now, broken, alone, finally forced to confront the consequences of his choices, I found that I was genuinely sad for him. Yes, I said simply, I'm sorry you're going through this. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the hospital around us. Finally, David spoke again. I need to tell you something. About that night, when Cynthia threw you out. David, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was stronger now, more determined than I'd heard it in years. I knew it was wrong. Even as it was happening, I knew it was cruel and unfair. But I was so angry about the will, so disappointed that Dad had left us so little, that I let Cynthia convince me you were the problem. He paused, struggling with words that had obviously been weighing on him for months. You raised me, Alberta. From the time I was 12 years old, you were more of a mother to me than my biological mother ever was. You came to my soccer games, helped me with homework, stayed up with me when I was sick. And the night Dad died, when I should have been protecting you and comforting you, I let my wife call you names and throw you out onto the street. Tears were sliding down his cheeks now, and I felt my own throat tighten with emotion. I've been living with that guilt for 6 months, and I needed you to know that I remember who you really are. Not the rich woman with all the power, though God knows I understand that now too, but the woman who bandaged my scraped knees and taught me how to drive, and never once made me feel like I was less important than her biological children. I reached over and took his uninjured hand in mine. Oh, David, I don't expect you to forgive me, he continued. I just needed you to know that I see now what I threw away, not the money or the inheritance or any of that. I threw away the one person in my life who loved me unconditionally. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. You didn't throw me away, honey. You made a mistake. A terrible, hurtful mistake, but not an unforgivable one. He squeezed my hand weakly. How can you say that? After what we did? Because I understand something now that I didn't 6 months ago. That night when Cynthia threw me out, I thought my world was ending. I thought I was losing my family, my home, everything that mattered. But what I was really losing was an illusion. David frowned, not understanding. I thought I was part of a loving family where everyone cared about each other. But the truth was, I was part of a system where my value was based on what I could provide, not who I was. That night forced me to see the difference. I adjusted my grip on his hand, choosing my words carefully. You and your siblings and Cynthia, you didn't know me at all. You knew the role I played, the function I served, but you never bothered to find out who I really was underneath. And because you didn't know me, you couldn't really love me. You loved what I did for you. David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. And now you're seeing me for the first time as a complete person. Someone with her own history, her own strength, her own worth that exists independently of what I can do for others. I smiled at him through my tears. And I'm seeing you clearly too, David, not as Richard's son or Cynthia's husband, but as the young man I helped raise who's finally learning to take responsibility for his choices. So, where does that leave us? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the doctor's call that morning. Where did it leave us? I had every right to walk away from this family permanently. I had every justification for letting them live with the consequences of their cruelty without interference from me. But sitting in that hospital room, holding the hand of the boy I'd helped raise, I realized that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. Justice had been served. They'd learned the truth about their assumptions and faced the natural consequences. Revenge would be withholding forgiveness from someone who was genuinely trying to make amends. It leaves us here, I said finally. Starting over, if you want to. Building a relationship based on who we actually are instead of who we thought we were supposed to be. David's eyes filled with fresh tears. You'd be willing to do that? After everything? I'd be willing to try, but it would be different this time, David. I'm not going to be the invisible woman who makes everything work behind the scenes. I'm not going to pretend to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. I wouldn't want you to. And I'm not going to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. If you want a relationship with me, you have to build it yourself, maintain it yourself, and value it for what it is, not for what it might get you. David nodded solemnly. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about money or inheritance or anything material. This is about two adults choosing to care about each other despite a very painful history. I know, and I want that, Alberta. I want to know you, the real you, not the version I created in my head. I studied his face, looking for any sign that this was manipulation or desperation talking. But what I saw was something I'd never seen from David before. Genuine remorse and a determination to do better. Then we'll try, I said, slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest communication. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be hard work, David. Unlearning 30 years of bad habits and assumptions isn't easy. I'm ready for hard work. These past 6 months have taught me I'm stronger than I thought I was. I squeezed his hand one more time, then stood up to leave. I'm going to go talk to your doctor about your discharge plans. Do you have somewhere to go when you get out of here? I've been staying in a studio apartment downtown. It's not much, but it's mine. Good. Independence suits you. As I walked toward the door, David's voice stopped me. Alberta, what about Marcus and Sarah? Do you think... I turned back to him. That's up to them, honey. My door is open, but they have to choose to walk through it. Just like you did. And Cynthia? I considered this. Cynthia, who had initiated the cruelty that started this whole mess. Cynthia, who had shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, only anger at being caught in her assumptions. Cynthia burned that bridge herself, I said quietly. Some actions have consequences that can't be undone. She chose to reveal her character, and now she has to live with what she revealed. David nodded, understanding the distinction. I left him there in his hospital bed, looking more peaceful than I'd seen him since he was a child. The walk back to my car felt different somehow. Lighter, like I was carrying less weight than when I'd walked in. That evening, I sat in my garden again as the sun set behind my roses. My phone had rung twice. Marcus and Sarah, probably having heard about David's accident through the family network. I'd let both calls go to voicemail, but I'd listen to the messages, tentative voices, awkward apologies, requests to talk, the first signs that the family I'd thought I'd lost forever might be reconsidering their assumptions. I'd call them back tomorrow, maybe, or maybe I'd wait and see if they called again. Either way, I was no longer in a hurry. I had time, resources, and for the first time in decades, complete control over my own life. The invisible woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Someone who could choose forgiveness or distance, engagement or solitude, based on what felt right, rather than what was expected. And that, I reflected as I watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, was worth more than $47 million, though the $47 million didn't hurt. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.